our forum for discussions. Science, technology has been so rapidly changing in the past 30, 40 years. Society by the scientists. Kindly log on to the Indian Academy of Sciences. There is independent website now called Dialogue, at ies.ac.in. This is an academy website. Under this dialogue, we also are trying to carry out several public meetings, public activities. In this very hall, about a month and a half ago, we had a whole day symposium. And then we had another symposium at JNU in Delhi, which was also sponsored partially by Dialogue. And we are envisaging a number of other activities. We are planning in ISR Pune, we are planning one in Hyderabad, we are planning one in Kolkata. And this lecture today is also a part of that kind of public activity under the general banner of Dialogue. By the way, most of the people, those who don't know me here, I know most of the people here. My name is Meva Singh, and I'm at the University of Mysore, and I'm the chief editor of Dialogue. So kindly log on to the Dialogue website, and I can see here so many people who can contribute to Dialogue. You would know what kind of categories we have. You know what kind of expectations we have, what kind of articles we are expecting. So please log on to Dialogue and see. Now, as a part of this activity, we have this today's lecture, and I invite Professor Amitabh Joshi, who is the editor of publications of Indian Academy of Sciences, to introduce the speaker and the topic, chair this session, and carry out the activities. Thank you, Amitabh.
Thanks, Meva. Good evening and welcome to all of you. It's a pleasure along multiple axes to introduce today's speaker. He's a very distinguished evolutionary biologist, and I am also, as many of you know, an evolutionary biologist. We actually coalesce back within a few academic generations to a common ancestor in the form of Theodosius Dobzhansky. I take one additional generation to coalesce back compared to Professor Coyne. So apart from his very well-received work, especially on mechanisms of speciation, Professor Coyne has also been a prolific writer, aiming the writing at public at large, not just evolutionary biologists. He has been very active in the US, where he is in the context of the debates between the so-called creationism or intelligent design and so on versus an evolutionary biology outlook. He's also generally been a very outspoken spokesperson for what one might call fact-driven as opposed to faith-driven ways of thinking. He has written books on such topics as well. He maintains a blog called Why Evolution is True, which discusses many of these issues of sort of broader philosophical interest to science and society, and the interaction between science as a method of knowing versus other methods of knowing, and so on. And in that context, it's a particular pleasure on behalf of the Academy and certainly on behalf of Dialogue to welcome Professor Coyne here and to invite him to deliver today's talk on the ways of knowing science versus everything else. Professor Jerry Coyne.
Hello, you can hear me, everybody? Okay, one request, maybe the lights could be turned down because some of the slides, well, okay, don't fall asleep. Okay. Thanks to the Indian Academy of Sciences and to the journal Dialogue, I suppose to Mr. Tata out there for making my lecture possible. As Dr. Joshi said, today's talk is not really about scientific research, at least the research that I've accomplished. It's about the nature of knowing in general. And are there ways of knowing about the world that go beyond science? And this is a claim that in America at least, and I think probably in India, is made very frequently. So today's talk is going to be divided into two parts. The first part is going to be, is science the only way of knowing about the universe? Or are there other ways that we could understand? And remember, the question is about the universe. What's about what's true in the cosmos and in the world? What about other areas of human endeavor? The humanities, arts, math, philosophy, literature, and especially religion, which is very often claimed to be a way of knowing. Now, by saying, the answer to this question is going to be yes. I can tell you right off the bat. These are not ways of knowing, but I do not mean to denigrate these other very worthwhile human activities. All I'm going to say in this talk is that these areas are not ways of understanding the universe. And I'll try to convince you of that during the talk. The second half of the talk will be, are there big questions that science can answer, that science can't answer, but religion can? So this will be a criticism of religion, not per se, because I don't care what you believe in terms of religion, but if you try to tell me that religion steps on the toes of science and can tell us that things that science can't, then I will argue with you. I mean, I think the whole purpose of this talk is to inspire argument. It certainly did in Chandigarh. And the answer to that question is going to be no. There are no questions that religion can answer that science can't. In fact, there are no questions that religion can answer at all with any kind of veracity. I know I'm treading on thin ground here in the land of the BJP, but I'm told that I'm immune. I'm told that I'm immune because I'm an American, so I don't have to wear a vest or anything. Okay, so let's start with the ways of knowing. The question is science the only way of knowing what's true about the universe? Are there other ways at which we can approach understanding of the universe we live in? And this claim is very frequent in the United States. For example, here's just something that came up a couple weeks ago at the University of Arizona in a biology class. And they're trying to teach evolution, but they're doing it in a climate in which there is religious, because you know America is an extremely religious country, even more religious than India. And the claim is evolution and science are excellent when it comes to answering what and how, but only religion is able to answer the why questions. And so science and religion are two different ways of knowing, implying that religion is a way to get knowledge. And the way that it supposedly, whoops, sorry, I turned this thing off. The way that it supposedly gets knowledge is by answering the why questions. And I'll get to that in the second part of the talk. But just realize that a lot of the questions that are supposedly why questions are really how questions, and that are within the ambit of science. So in order to try to convince you that science, and I'm going to have to define science for you because I have a peculiar conception of it, is the only way of knowing about the universe, I have to answer three questions, or give three definitions. First of all, what is science? What do I mean by science? Second of all, what do I mean by truth? Because my claim is that science is the only way of knowing what's true about the universe and getting knowledge about the universe. And third of, whoops, these damn things. And finally, what is knowledge? What's the difference between truth and knowledge? So I'm going to do this very briefly because this is not rocket science, it's science. So first of all, what is science? And my conception of science is what I call science broadly construed. You could say science is, for example, what I do as a professor when I go to my lab every day. It's a job. That's not the way I mean it here. I could say science is the body of facts that scientists like me accumulate over time. But that's not true either because those facts are ephemeral. Most of them change over time. What I conceive of as science is a methodology. a methodology for understanding what's true about the universe, which incorporates a series of empirical tools, a toolkit that's been accumulated over the last 500 years through experience. Nobody sat down and said, okay, this is the scientific method. What happened is that the tools of science accumulated gradually as we learned that they were able to give us repeatable truths and things that could actually help us, like cure diseases or grow better crops. So science is what I call the empirical attitude, and it's called science broadly construed. The use of the tools like doubt, like inquiring about nature, doing experiments, raising hypotheses, trying to knock those hypotheses down, the constant overweening criticism and questioning of yourself that you have to do when you do science, and then the more formal tools of science, the use of statistics and mathematics, blind testing, etc. But you don't have to do all that to do science. So for example, here's a woman doing what we conceive of as doing science, but there's somebody also doing science, it's an archaeologist, because archaeologists also use the empirical attitude. They date things properly, they do cross-checking, they criticize each other, as you know from human archaeology. So this can also be conceived of science. But it goes further than that. There's somebody doing science, he's your plumber, who's trying to find a leak in your sink. And when a plumber does that, they use the empirical attitude. They make hypotheses. Where is the water coming from? There are only certain ways that water can flow according to the principles of hydrodynamics. He makes hypotheses, he tests them, and eventually he finds out the source of the leak and fixes it. So this guy is practicing what I call science broadly construed. Same thing with the car mechanic. If they try to find out where the electrical short is in your car, it's a complicated procedure which involves a number of hypotheses and a number of empirical tests before they finally do it. So all of these people are doing science broadly construed. And I would consider these people, maybe not scientists as a profession, but using science and using it in a way which tells them how to find things out. For example, this guy is not going to find out where the short is in your car by praying about it. That's not a good way to do that, or waiting for a revelation from above. You have to do it empirically. Okay, that's science for me. And that's the definition I'm going to use for the rest of this talk. What is truth? Well, I use the Oxford English Dictionary as my arbiter here because, as we all know, this in English, this is the truth about what words mean, so nobody can argue with me. Truth is conformity with fact, agreement with reality. This is what you all know of and what you intuitively think of as the truth. What is accurate, correct, and verifiable. Another way to look at this is Stephen Jay Gould's definition of what a fact is: a truth confirmed to such a degree that it would be perverse to withhold provisional assent. Here we have two notions. The first one is confirmation. A truth is not a personal thing. Not in science, it's not. It has to be confirmed by other people. And it's this consensus attitude towards truth which makes it's one of the empirical tools in the scientific toolkit. And second of all, it's provisional. In science, we have no absolute truths. We have things that come close to being absolute truths, things that are so well established, like evolution, that it would be foolish to, I mean, you could bet all the money you owned that it was true and you would be pretty safe, or that water is H2O. But in general, no scientist would claim that they've ever found the absolute last unchangeable truth about the universe. So that's two aspects of scientific truth that I want to talk about. What about knowledge? Is there any difference between truth and knowledge? And my definition of knowledge, which comes from the Oxford English Dictionary, somewhat lightened up: the public acceptance of facts. So a truth that you find out as an individual becomes knowledge when it becomes widely accepted by rational people, people who have the ability to judge the evidence for the truth of something. So when I ask you if science is the only way of knowing about the universe, what I'm asking is this question: is there any way to grasp consensus truth about the nature of our cosmos besides what I call science broadly construed? And the answer is no, there's not. And I will challenge any of you to give me any other area. But before I do that, I'm going to list the areas which other people say are ways of acquiring knowledge. So these are areas that are touted as being ways of knowing, in America at least, and perhaps some of these in India. And I've divided them into 4 groups: the so-called social sciences here, then the logical sciences, philosophy and mathematics, and then we have the humanities, literature, art, and music, Personal feelings, can you get truth from personal feelings? And finally, religion, can you get truth from religion? And I'm going to go through these areas very quickly and trying to show you that only one of these groups, the one in light blue here, has any claim to being a way of telling us what's true about the universe, and that these other areas cannot do so by the very nature of their endeavors. Okay, social science, history, anthropology, archaeology, and economics. In general, yes, these can be practiced according to the empirical toolkit. You can do, for example, anthropology and archaeology according to scientific principles. You use dating methods, cross-checking, testing hypotheses, etc. History, we know that Julius Caesar lived. How do we know this? Empirical evidence. There are coins with his image on them. There are his own writings. There are statues of Julius Caesar. And there are the writings of his contemporaries, which vouch for the fact that this man really lived. So all of these are an empirical way of testing whether something actually happened in history. In fact, there's a lot more evidence that Julius Caesar existed than, for example, Jesus Christ existed, where there's no evidence at all except for what's in the Bible. Social sciences, insofar as they're scientific, yes, social sciences can be scientific. They can do studies, they can test them, they can test hypotheses. And economics, which is often called the dismal science, because people think it's not really scientific at all. There are some, I've talked to economists, there are some truths about human behavior that can be discerned from economics. And one of them is the declining demand curve with quantity. So for example, the more doses you have, the fewer doses you want. Okay, this is true for any good, and it's a universal of human behavior. So this kind of, and that's the truth about human behavior, at least a generalization. So these areas, in principle, yes, they are ways of getting knowledge. They're not often considered science per se, but they can be science, and they can tell us about knowledge. Now, some of them can't. Some of them become a bit dicey. For example, historians that argue about the causes of various wars. Well, those questions can't be settled empirically because we can't repeat the hypotheses. So in some ways, some of these areas are not acting like science, like they're being pursued by scientists, but in general, you cannot rule these out as ways of knowing. What about philosophy and mathematics? These are peculiar because they're not, philosophy and math cannot tell you what's true about the universe. Mathematics is a human construct that's made of axioms. Philosophy is a series of logical deductions from a set of beginning premises. So for both of these, it's a series of finding out what's true within a set of arbitrary assumptions that the human brain makes. And so that is not a way of finding out what's true about the universe. It's finding out what's true within this system that you've constructed amongst yourself. Now, I'm not saying that these aren't helpful for science, because philosophy is very useful for scientists in many cases. And mathematics is essential for many scientists. But by itself, math and philosophy are not ways of knowing. But it would be foolish to say that we don't get any kind of knowledge about them, so I'm going to hedge a bit by saying, for example, within the system of trigonometry and Western mathematics, we know, for example, that the ratio of the circumference to the diameter of a circle is pi. Now, that's not a fact about the universe. That's a fact about a set of human assumptions about what's true, and in some series of geometry, this is not true. So because philosophy and mathematics are not ways of knowing about the universe, they're ways about knowing what's true within a set of logical assumptions, we can speak sensibly of proof. We can make proofs in mathematics. We can make proofs in philosophy. You cannot make proofs in science the way we know it. I cannot prove to you that evolution occurred, okay? But I can convince you that it's very, very likely to have happened. But no scientist worth his or her salt would ever say that we can prove what's true about the universe. It's just the provisional nature of science. What about literature and art and mathematics? This is the stuff that I argue about most frequently in the United States. Humanities professors will come up to me and you say, you practice scientism. Scientism, by the way, is a slur which is hurled at people like me to say, you think you have the monopoly on finding truth about the universe. Well, we do too, because we can find truths about the universe from literature, art, and music. They express these so-called human universal truths, and this is a way of, and you're not the only person that can do this. It's especially the postmodernists that like to hurl these slanders at us, And I will tell you that this is wrong. But again, I want to emphasize that I'm not trying to devalue these areas, because I'm a great fan of literature, and I'm a huge fan of art and music. It's just that I don't think they're good ways to find out what's true about the universe, and I'll tell you why. First of all, it is conceivable that art and literature can give you a guideline to what might have been true at certain times when a work of art was created. For example, I'm going to give you two examples, and I'm sorry that my familiarity with Indian art and literature, while being higher than that of most Westerners, is not high enough that I can use examples from like the Bhagavad Gita or the Ramayana or anything like that. So I'll use Western examples here and hope that maybe you're familiar with some of them. So here's how you might get some kind of knowledge from literature. How many of you are familiar with Herman Melville's Moby Dick? This is considered one of the great novels written in English. It was written in the 18th century, and it's about catching a great white whale, which is a metaphor for many things. Nobody's quite sure. But if you read the book, you'll find that there are huge sections on what it's like to catch whales in the 18th century. You have to go on little boats and spear them, and it's actually quite accurate. So you could say, well, isn't this a way of knowing about how whales were caught? A historical reconstruction of the past. Does this not give us knowledge? And the answer is no. Because how do you know that this work of fiction is really telling you the truth? How do you find that out? You go back and check other sources about what it was like to be a whaler in the 18th century. Sorry, early 19th century. So you can't say that this by itself tells you what's true about even whaling. You have to check other sources. Here's another example. This is a portrait of Philip IV by Velázquez, and he's a member of the Habsburg family. You'll notice he has this protruding lower lip. And you could say, well, doesn't this give us information about what somebody looked like? Isn't there knowledge here from this work of art? And the answer is not really. Suppose the painter made this up. How do we know that this is an accurate depiction of Philip IV? Well, you have to do empirical checking. And if you do that and go back and read history, you'll find that, yes, indeed, the Habsburgs all had this condition, and it's called mandibular prognathism. It's a genetic defect, not a serious one. And so you find from other sources that this is true. So what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that literature can give you knowledge about what's true about the universe, but it always requires independent verification from other sources. In other words, the use of science construed broadly, the empirical toolkit. I would defy any of you to tell me about a truth that can come only from a work of literature, particularly a work of fiction, because that's what I mean by literature. Or what something felt like. Okay, so these things describe what something looked like or what something acted like. What about what something felt like? And this is the argument I get most commonly, that literature tells us something about the way humanity feels, that we have some kind of universal set of reactions to our circumstances that is a form of knowledge. And for this, I'd like to use two examples because they're very similar to one another. The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Leo Tolstoy, and the movie Ikuru by Kurosawa. Maybe some of you are familiar with these. What they have in common is they're both about men facing their own deaths. Okay, and how do they react to their own deaths? In fact, this book was used in America 100 years ago to teach medical students what it was like to die, because it is supposedly such an accurate description of what it feels like to die. How do we know that? Not because Tolstoy told us, but because you can compare Tolstoy from what patients tell you. In other words, you empirically cross-check this knowledge from with other data that you can acquire independently, science-accredited. But more important than this, there are moral lessons that can be drawn from these movies. For example, in this book, Ivan Ilyich, who's tormented by the fact that he's going to die, suddenly feels better. He redeems himself on his deathbed by realizing that he's lived a moral life. So he feels better. And that's supposedly the truth from this novel, that you can redeem your life at the end by realizing that you lived in a moral way. Now here's another book. This is a movie. This is, to my mind, one of the two greatest movies ever made. It's about a Japanese fellow, and it means to live, Ikuru in Japanese, who's been diagnosed with stomach cancer. And he knows he's going to die. And he has to redeem himself. He realizes as a bureaucrat that his life has been a waste because he spends all day shuffling papers. and he realizes this is a meaningless endeavor. What does he do? He redeems himself by building a playground for children. And it almost makes me weep to think of this because it's such a beautiful movie. But then in the last scene of the movie, here he is, he's built his playground, it's snowing, he's singing in the swings, he's going to die soon, but he realizes his life has been redeemed. Okay, so that's his truth. And this is Ivan Elliott's truth. What truth about the universe do we get from these books? We don't. What we get is the author's intention of how we should feel about how we should feel as we approach death. These are very different ways of redeeming your lives. Which one is true? There isn't any, because there are many, many different ways that humans can approach their end. So literature is not really a way of knowing, it's a way of feeling. It's a way of putting yourself in somebody's shoes and experiencing what they experienced, and I'll talk more about that in a sec. As I said, there's diverging interpretations. If you read 100 books on one topic, 100 novels, say, on love, you're going to get a different take in every single one. Is there any truth in any of those? The only truth you can find is that this is what the novelist wrote, and perhaps this is what the novelist intended us to take away from the book. But that's not knowledge that's anywhere close to knowledge about the universe. Okay? Same thing with religion. So look at the history of religious art. Now, again, I'm only going to talk about Western art here, and there's only 2 paintings. This actually, even though I'm an atheist, is one of my favorite paintings. This is the middle panel of the Isenheim altarpiece, painted by Matthias Grunewald in the 16th century. And it's a beautiful, moving painting of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. And it's meant to glorify Christianity, as you can see. I mean, there's Mary weeping there. I'm not sure which saint this is. I was raised Jewish, not Christian. There's a sheep and everything. But again, much of the religious art before the 20th century was meant to show that religion was not only true, that this happened, but it was an extremely powerful and meaningful way to gain knowledge. Well, what kind of knowledge do you get from this? We don't even have any evidence that this man existed. All you can get from this is that the artist felt that Jesus' crucifixion was something to be glorified. Now here's a piece of art from the 20th century. Is anybody familiar with this? It's called Piss Christ. And it was by the Spanish artist Andres Serrano. And it consists of a plastic crucifix immersed in a beaker of the artist's own urine. And this is meant to mock religion, to show that it's a foolish thing to do. Okay, so we have this and we have this. What's the truth? Is religion a glorious endeavor, one of the highest products of human knowledge, or is it something that's just dumb and foolish and could be represented with urine? Well, there is no answer. There is no truth here. What we have is different takes on a system of thought. So if you say that art is a way of knowing, and I would, again, challenge you to tell me anything about art that is true, that doesn't need to be verified by science, there are certain problems that arise. Let me give you just one example. I was in an argument with the literary critic Adam Gopnik, who writes for The New Yorker, and he said, yes, literature is a way of knowing, and here's what it tells us, that the order of birth in a family has an effect on the personality of the children. So that firstborns are more dominant than laterborns, they're more careful, they're less risky. Second of all, this blah, 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 blah. And he said, this comes from literature, because I've read a lot of books, and all these books say that this is a truth about human personality. And then he said that Frank Soloway, who actually did a scientific analysis of birth order and personality, found the same thing out later on. So that this was actually a truth that was first found out by art and only later confirmed by science. Well, unfortunately for Mr. Gopnik, Soloway's work was repeated and it didn't stand up. There is no effect of birth order on human personality as far as we can see, except that firstborns tend to be slightly more intelligent than laterborns. Okay, but that's not the hypothesis that Gopnik is making. Besides, Adam is only citing 4 or 5 novels. I mean, there's 1,000 novels about human families. You can pick and choose the ones you want to demonstrate anything you want. That's not a way to do science. That's a way where you have a preconceived bias that you reinforce by picking out what evidence you use. So that's the problem with arty ways of knowing. In fiction, there are no hypotheses. In the same way with art and music, there is no way of collecting data to verify what's asserted within a work of art. There's no safeguard against the artist's bias, and there's no dealing with objections. Okay? Second of all, and this is the problem with Adam Gopnik's argument against me, you can only sample a few works. And what these people do who say that art is a way of knowing is to just pick out a few pieces of art that support their hypothesis and then ignore the rest, which doesn't support their hypothesis. Now, as a scientist, you know this is not the way that we do science. If we tried to do science like that, we would be abysmal failures and laughed out of the scientific community. Same thing, cherry picking of the field, confirmation bias, choosing those examples that support your particular hypothesis. The task of art, literature, and music is not investigation of what's true. It is representation of the artist's feelings and in a way that engages our emotion. And it can engage our emotions in many ways. It can make us feel a commonality. You can read a piece of art and say, yeah, that's the way I feel. And you feel good about yourself. Or you recognize similarities, but you might not. You might feel completely different from somebody else. But you might say, well, that's interesting. That's the way it feels to be somebody that's completely different from me. But is it? You don't know, because it's fiction. It's made up fiction. So there's no real truth here. But again, art is not a useless subject, not by any means. I spend half my time reading art and literature. But its job is not to tell us what's true. Art is explicitly meant to engage your emotions, and art that does not engage your emotions can hardly be called art. But emotion is not something that should be part of scientific research or any kind of science whatsoever. Once your emotions are engaged, you're not doing science anymore. You have to maintain that completely objective attitude. You have to be self-critical. That's part of the toolkit of science. So can literature make any contribution whatsoever to ways of knowing? And my answer is yes, it can in one limited way. That you might read something in literature that might let you form a hypothesis about how the world is. And for example, Adam Gopnik's claim that I've read these books and it seems that there's a certain similarity between the order of birth in a family and the kind of personality that you have. Well, if you're a scientist, you can say, well, that's interesting. Maybe I should go study this and investigate it. Frank Soloway, I mean, he did this on his own, and he said there was a definite effect of birth order, but unfortunately, it wasn't replicated. But if it could have been true, and if it was true, then literature would have been a source for hypotheses about its truth. But that's very different from telling us what is true. It's only a way of forming hypotheses. Okay, so that's the problem with art of knowing. Two other things, personal feelings. This is the archetypal accusation against a scientist that say that science is the way of knowing. A guy that says, I know my wife loves me. You scientists can't tell me that, but I know it because I feel it. Okay, well, let's examine this closely. Does the guy's wife love him? That's what he feels. What if you followed his wife and found out she was having an affair with another guy or two? Or she didn't really love him? We can see this empirically tested every day, at least in America, if you see groups of teenage girls. And there's a girl that's gone out on a date, and they're all trying to figure out if the guy really likes her or not. So they ask each other empirical questions like, did he call you back? Did he send you flowers? Did he say he was going to ask you out again? Did he kiss you? These are all empirical ways of verifying a subjective feeling. Now, someday science might be able to answer this question if we had some kind of way to correlate our empirical feeling of love with the hormones that we have. But until we do that, a statement like that is a purely subjective truth. And in order to see under any definition of love whether this is really a scientific truth, you have to use empirical investigation. So a statement like this does not bear any relationship to the truth that we in science have. Another one is I'm hungry. If I feel hungry, doesn't it mean I'm hungry? Well, yes, you have the subjective feeling you're hungry, but are you really hungry? We all know people that say that. He could be lying. We all know people that say they're hungry, and then you take them out to dinner, and they hardly eat anything. We have the saying in America, your eyes are bigger than your stomach. I don't know if you have this in India. But again, a subjective declaration of the way you feel is not an objective truth about the universe. It's what we call a subjective truth, and we don't even know if that's subjectively true because people might be lying. It requires empirical checks. So again, there's no knowledge of these personal revelations without empirical verification. And finally, we get to the thing that everybody hates to talk about because it's, at least in the US, we're a hyper-religious country, is religion. Religion uses different methods of verifying its so-called truths than does science. These are the four methods: dogma, scripture, revelation, and authority. And religion, I will maintain, and I will maintain, I'll stand on here on this stage for days if you want, arguing that religion is not a way of understanding anything about the universe. It's incompatible, in fact, with science in three ways. It has different methodology. It does not use the empirical attitude when it finds out the truths it declares. The outcomes of religious investigation, that is what religion has claimed to be true, is different from what science finds to be true. And then there's the philosophical disparity, which I won't talk about. And in fact, if you want to see all this laid out in detail, you can read my latest book, Faith versus Fact. Now, first of all, I have to emphasize that at least in the West, the Abrahamic religions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, they do maintain that they give us truths about the universe. They don't say that religion is just a way of expressing communality with your fellow human beings, a way to get together with them on Sunday and feel good about yourself. They say that religion, at bottom, is based on certain empirical assertions about the universe. And this is in the Bible. Now here's from 1 Corinthians. If Christ be not risen, then our preaching is in vain, and your faith is also in vain. In other words, if Jesus wasn't resurrected, then there's no point in being a Christian. So this means that the empirical verification of this resurrection is a keystone towards being a Christian. You can hardly call yourself a Christian in America if you do not believe in the resurrection. But it's not just that. Here's some more modern theologians, and some of these are scientists, like Francis Collins, who's head of the National Institutes of Health, who explicitly recognize that religion often makes claims about the way things are. And a way of life based on religion presupposes belief about the nature of reality. And religion cannot be sustained if those beliefs are no longer credible. So religion expresses certain moral strictures. It gives us a way to worship with other people and maybe feel good, and we even work together with other people for the common good. It also is based at the bottom on assertions about what is true. Assertions which are certainly not true. In other words, that are false. At most, one religion is true, and that means that every other religion is false. Now, the fact that religion makes empirical claims about the universe can be substantiated in my country by what Americans believe. This is a survey of what all Americans, this is not just religious Americans, they canvass Americans and they ask them, what do you believe is true? Is there God? Personal God that's concerned with you personally, not just some theistic God. 68%. Jesus was the Son of God, 68%. Jesus was resurrected, 65%. There's an afterlife, 68%. You can see the figures. They're all about 65 to 80%. That there's heaven, an afterlife, hell and Satan, angels, and survival of the soul after death. These are empirical claims about the way the universe is. These are scientific claims, or at least claims that in principle could be tested by science and have been tested by science. For example, that prayer, I don't know if prayer is on here, but many people believe that prayer works if you pray to God. That's been tested scientifically, and it doesn't. In fact, it seems to make you worse, if anything. But this just goes to show you that the basis of religion, at least in my country, is empirical assumptions about religion. I think this is true for many Hindus, not all of them, who believe that resurrection is an important part, or not resurrection, reincarnation, if you can say my Christian tendencies, that you come back in another existence based on how you believe. I know not all Hindus believe that, but some do. And that's, again, an empirical assertion, a very hard one to test, but in principle it could be tested if, for example, a human came back and described very accurately, beyond the knowledge of anybody presently existing, the life of somebody that they were thousands of years ago. Okay. Anyway, there's the methodological incompatibilities between science and religion can be summarized in what a trope I made up in science: faith is a vice. You don't have faith in science. Anybody that says I have faith that my experiment will work or has worked this way is going to be laughed out of science. But in religion, faith is a virtue. And in America, you will see somebody come on television and they'll say, we have a man of faith with us here. That's supposed to be a compliment, but it's really an insult, because faith means belief without any evidence behind it. That's what faith is. I mean, the Bible says that, but I won't go through the virtues. In science, you have ways of knowing you're wrong. If you ask me how evolution could be disproved, I could give you 10 or 12 different ways that, in principle, evolution would be wrong. But you can't. If you ask a Christian what would convince you that Jesus wasn't the Son of God and wasn't resurrected, they would most likely say nothing, because I have faith that this happened. This makes it an explicitly ascientific attitude, and in fact, it defies my understanding of how somebody can be scientific and religious at the same time. Because as soon as you cross the door of your lab, you're an atheist. You cannot use faith to practice science. If you cross the door of your church or of your temple, you explicitly abandon rationality and start believing things for which there are no evidence. Now, I realize I'm being hard on religion here, and I apologize if you're a religious scientist and I've offended you, but I have to tell you what I believe, because I would not be honest with myself if I didn't. And you have plenty of time to argue with me afterwards. Okay, now, and the incompatibility of outcomes, this is what Christianity tells us that is true. Creationism, 76% of Americans are creationists. They believe that there was an exodus from Egypt, the great flood, that prayer works, that the earth is 10,000 years old. This is what religion has told us. It's all wrong. So these are empirical conclusions from studying the Bible that used to be held as truths, as ways of knowing, but they're not true. And they can't be true because the outcomes differ among different religions. So the incompatibility, religion is not only incompatible with science, it's incompatible with other religions. And I can show this simply by showing you a phylogeny of religions here. This is you could do a phylogeny of religions the same way we do a phylogeny of organisms, because we know which religions came from other religions and we know when. So this is the phylogeny of religion. It starts back about 20,000 years ago, and then it splits into different branches. For example, up in the top here, in orange and yellow, we have Christianity, but this is an underestimate of the number of Christian sects. There are actually 41,000 denominations of Christianity. This is Islam. There's only 3 branches, Sunni, Sufi, and Shia, but we know that there are actually many more sects of Islam than that. Here's the Jews, my ancestors, and they're all off by themselves, lonely branch here. They're only in Coyne, I think, in India. But of course, there's several branches of Judaism as well. And then here we have the religions that are predominant in this country: Hinduism and Islam, Jain, Sikhs, etc. And then the religions of Africa. Now, the important thing about this graph is that these splits usually arise because of contrasting claims about what's true in the universe. And for example, the 2 sects of Lutherans in America who hate each other. They hate each other because one of them claims that evolution is true and the other one claims that it isn't. There are the Unitarians that have split from the Trinitarians because one of them believes in a Trinity and the other one doesn't believe in a Trinity. Is there an afterlife? Jews say there's no afterlife. Most people say that there is. Jehovah's Witnesses don't think that you should be allowed to receive blood transfusions. Catholics don't believe that women can be priests. Anglicans do. So each of these splits, by and large, represents a conflicting claim about either moral stricture or what is true about the universe. There's no way to decide which religion is right. Okay? Now, can you contrast this with science? Here's the phylogeny of science. It's pretty much a straight line, because each scientist contributes in a way that is in general agreed upon by other scientists, because we have this toolkit. We have some side branches here, like this might be the idea that the continents were static and didn't move, which was what I learned when I was in grade school. This might be string theory here, which is a viable hypothesis, but we don't know if it's true or not. But by and large, science is not like this. So when I come to India, for example, and I've talked to many of my colleagues, we speak a common language. We have similar recognitions about what has been true and what's established. It's not like I'm a Shia and meeting a Sunni and trying to figure out what's true. We have a common language. We have a general agreement on what has been established in the universe, and it's very different from religions. Scientists don't kill each other over debates about string theory or evolution, okay? The reason we don't is because we have ways of knowing what's true, ways of settling arguments that doesn't require guns or bombs or anything like that, okay? So, I mean, I'm ahead of time, but does religion reveal truth? And my answer is no. I defy you to tell me one truth that religion has told us I mean, you might say, well, there's moral truths like the golden rule. And I'll say, well, that's not a truth about the universe. That's a truth about human thought. We can talk more about that later. Theological knowledge does not home in on any widely arranged truth. The upshot is that religion is not a way of knowing anything. It's a way of humans deceiving themselves into thinking what is true. There's a friend of mine, Mike House, who used to be a non-denominational pastor in Houston. For years, he was a Christian, and for years he taught his congregation that science and religion are different ways of knowing. In other words, he taught them what I'm telling you is wrong and are not in conflict because they answer different questions. Science focuses on how the world came to be. Religion addresses the why questions. You remember this trope that you hear over and over again. And then he realized, and he became an atheist when he realized this, I was dead wrong. There are not different ways of knowing. There is knowing and there's not knowing, and those are the only two options in this world. And I would claim that the only way of knowing is the method of science construed broadly. Okay, now the second and shorter part of the talk I'll move to, which is based on science focuses on how the world came to be, and religion addresses the question of why we are here. And it's very common in America to hear the claim that religion answers the big existential questions about the universe, or that philosophy can do this, or the humanities can do this, and science cannot. So there's a whole ambit of human knowledge which is accessible to, again, more or less religion and not accessible to science. And these are the so-called why questions. And I'm going to give you a list of these why questions in a second. But here's that sentiment expressed by the famous Czech philosopher Leszek Kołakowski, who says, who am I? Where did I come from? You can already see what these why questions are. Where do I fit in? Why am I responsible? What does my life mean? How will I face death? Well, we already learned two different ways to face death. Religion is a paramount aspect of human culture. The more scientific discovery reveals, the more we realize it cannot answer the great existential questions. There's got to be another way to answer these great existential questions. That way is supposed to be religion. So here's a list of the big existential questions that science is supposed to be immune to answering. I don't know if you can see these. I'm not going to read them all, but I'll read a couple. What's going on in the universe? Why are we here? Who am I? What does my life mean? How should we live? Why be moral? Why is there evil? Why do we die? Do we live on after death? These are the great existential questions. This list was made by John Hott, who's a Catholic theologian at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., who made the claim in his book, Deeper Than Darwin, that it is the main business of religion to answer the big questions. Now note the use of big questions. This is a subtle dig at science, okay? Because, now why do religious people like this have it's a dig because the big questions are the religious questions, and science can answer the little questions. You know? Why do religious people feel this way about science? It's because there's an asymmetry in knowledge, that science can tell religious people that what they believe is wrong. And creationism is one example of that. The lack of the Exodus from Egypt, no archaeological evidence there, no evidence for a great flood or a 10,000-year earth. Science can show that religion is wrong. Religion cannot show that science is wrong. There's no way it can do that because it's incapable of it. Religious people realize this, and so their response is to denigrate science. Okay. They always bring, and there's two ways of doing it. First of all, you say, well, we can't answer these questions. We scientists, you guys can't answer these questions, but we can. And second of all, they make these little sly digs. And they coined the term scientism, which is supposed to be the stepping of scientists outside the boundaries of where they're supposed to stay, which is factual questions about the universe, not realizing that religion makes factual claims about the universe as well. Okay, so let's say, does religion or anything besides science actually answer these big questions? What do we mean by answering these big existential questions? Well, there's two things. First of all, you just respond. I mean, this is what you get if you go to your pastor and you ask him, who am I? Well, yeah, you can get a response, but that's not what we want because we're scientists. We want a correct response. We want a true response. Whoops, sorry. So that's the first thing, that if you want an answer to an existential question, you want the answer that's the correct answer. do these existential questions have correct answers? Well, you know already that most of them don't. Do the big questions make sense? Are they even sensible to ask these questions? And the answer is no. Some of them are meaningless or ambiguous questions. For example, is there a God? That's a meaningless question in one sense, and that, what do we mean by God? We have in America a group of people called pantheists who believe that the universe is God, or that love is God. I mean, that's in the 60s, God is love. That was what we heard all the time, which was an excuse to copulate with anybody that was around. But unless you specify what kind of God you mean, this question is meaningless, okay? What is the point of it all? What does that mean? What does it mean to ask that kind of question? Even to ask that question presumes that there is a God, because the point is something that's supposed to be given to you by God. So as you'll see, so many of these questions presuppose the existence of a deity to even have meaning in the first place. Do all the big questions have objective answers? No, they don't. For example, how should we live? There's no objective answer. I mean, you over there might want to live in a different way from somebody else. I mean, it's based on your taste, your predilections, your background, and your genetics. So there's no objective answer to this question at all. And what can we hope for? I mean, how can we answer a question like that? And if you had asked me before November, I would have said, well, I'd hope for Hillary Clinton to win the election. You know? I was my hope was sorely disappointed. I mean, that alone may be proof that there's no God. I mean, what kind of God would give us Donald Trump as President of the United States? It would have to be the kind of God that nobody believes in, which is a mean, nasty, angry, vindictive God. Okay, but let's leave that aside. I'm fulminating now. Do some big questions with objective answers have religious rather than scientific questions? So this is the crux of my talk. Are there answers to the big existential questions that can come from religion? Well, first of all, you know that different religions give different answers to what you should believe. Okay? For example, if I ask, for example, a Unitarian in America, is homosexuality immoral? They would say, no, of course not. I mean, it's not a choice you make, and it's not moral or immoral. If you go to Saudi Arabia and you ask somebody, is homosexuality immoral? Well, in every Muslim majority question, more than 90% of the people think that homosexuality is immoral. So what's the objective answer to that question? We don't know, because different religions give different answers. And some of the more scientific questions, like where did the universe come from, or is there an afterlife? These are big questions, and there is no religious answer that makes sense. The creation myths differ amongst every different religion. According to physicists, the universe didn't come from anywhere. It's a meaningless question if you're a physicist. And is there an afterlife? Well, religion says yes, in many cases there are, but there's no scientific answer to that question. At least the answer that we have in science is there's no evidence for this at all, so there's no reason to think it exists. Remember that all religions differ in not only their moral codes, but also in the very propositions they make about the nature of the universe. There either is or is not a God. There either is or is not an afterlife. Either Jesus was the Messiah or Allah was the prophet. They can't all be true, okay? And there's no way of deciding which one is true. In science, when we get this kind of dichotomy of opinion, we just throw the question away because we say it's unanswerable. So therefore, we needn't deal with it. Are all the big questions with objective answers scientific or empirical questions? And my answer here is yes, they are. That if you have a big existential question and there is a real, meaningful, and true answer to that, it's a scientific question. And now I'll get into how science can answer some of these questions. Where would I come from? Why is there so much suffering? Was Jesus a divine miracle-working being? These questions are all principal empirical scientific questions, and I'll give you the scientific answers to at least the first two of this. The third one is we have no evidence for this at all. Okay. Can all scientific questions be answered? If a big existential question turns out to be a scientific question because it makes a claim that can be tested empirically, can we answer it? And the answer is no, and any scientist knows there's some questions that are simply beyond our ability to answer, and we have to be able to live with the doubt that comes with that. For example, how did life begin? This is a question I'm always asked in my public lectures, and the answer is, how the hell do I know? I wasn't there. Now, and we don't know, and we don't have any way of knowing. Now, we may be able to replicate the origin of life in the laboratory under prebiotic conditions, but that doesn't mean that that's the way life started in the first place. It may have started in a completely different fashion. So this question, I think, will never be answered. And it's just like the question of what did Julius Caesar have for breakfast the day that he was assassinated? Well, we don't know, and we don't have any records, and we don't have any way of knowing it, so we just have to live with that kind of doubt. Other kinds of questions are in principle answerable, but are very difficult to answer. What is the neurological basis of consciousness? Why do we feel that we are beings, even though we're just molecules and collection of neurons? What is this collection of neurons called Coyne? I don't know the answer to that question. Someday I think we will, when we understand how the brain works better, how we come to have this feeling that we are unitary beings that are somehow sitting in a driver's seat in a car that lives in our brain. And is string theory an accurate description of physics? We don't know the answer to that question. It may be that we'll never know the answer to that question because it's very difficult to test empirically. Although now that we have evidence for eternal cosmic inflation, it is possible that string theory might be true. Okay, so back to the big questions. And we'll get a little humorous here as I approach the end of this talk because I'm almost done. Here's the list of questions I gave you. Now, virtually all of these presuppose the existence of a God. When you ask a question of should we live, the big question answer is the way God tells us to live. Okay, that's what John Hott would say. That's the answer. But if you ask a Catholic, how should we live, versus a Muslim, versus a Hindu, versus an atheist, they're all going to give you different answers. So most of these questions presuppose the existence of a deity that gives our life meaning and purpose, but we have no evidence for such a deity, which renders these questions completely meaningless at the outset, because they presuppose something for which we have no evidence. Which means that the big questions cannot be answered, that religion cannot give us the answers to these big questions. These are questions for us to ponder personally and find our own personal way through, but they don't have any objective answers. But so these are the ones that really presuppose God. I put the red asterisk to them. Some of them, like, who am I? You don't necessarily have to have a God to be able to answer this question, but most of them do. The ones in black are big questions that we have scientific answers to. So science can indeed answer some of the big existential questions. You might not like the answers, but they're the true answers, and I'm going to tell you what a few of them are as I end this lecture. First of all, why are we here? What do the religious people say about that? Well, different religions give us different answers. The best religious answer is we're here because God made us, and we're God's special creatures. Homo sapiens is the species. This, for example, is why many Muslims believe in evolution, but except for human evolution, because the Quran says that humans were created. So this presupposes the existence of a deity for which we have no evidence. So this answer is meaningless from the outset. Scientific answer. We have an answer. We're here because we evolved from a primate ancestor and so on, from another ancestor, from a prosimian ancestor, from a mammalian ancestor, from a reptilian ancestor, all the way back to the first universal common ancestor about 4 billion years ago, and it all started with the Big Bang. Okay, that's the answer to this question. If you want any other kind of answer, you're not going to get a correct answer. This happens to be the correct answer to that question. Where did I come from? Religious answer, again, God made us, right? Because he wanted us to be here. Well, who knows? Non-religious answer? Your parents, a little wine, a little Sinatra. I guess in India it would be Tagore rather than Sinatra. I'm not sure what music is considered music to make babies by in India, but in America it's Sinatra. And here it might be Tagore, although that might be too religious. But also there's another answer, which is evolution. This is where we came from, and if you read Richard Dawkins' book, The Magic of Reality, this is the correct answer to the great existential question. If you ask, but no, this isn't not what I meant. What I meant is where did I really come from? And the answer to that is, I don't know, what do you mean? And they say, well, God made you. And I say, okay, give me evidence for God. And then that's where the discussion stops, because they can't do it. Why does anything exist at all? Where does the universe come from? Well, religious answer again. That's the way God wanted it to be. Very convenient answer. The scientific answer, we don't know. This is part of the doubt that we have to live with. that we don't know why anything exists rather than nothing. There may be multiple universes, some of which, and I think, I'm coming to believe this now, that there are multiple universes because there's evidence for it. And some religions there are humans, and some religions there aren't. And in our universe happens to have the right laws of physics that allow us to exist and allow me to be up here and giving you this lecture, okay? In terms of where does the universe come from? Well, it came from the Big Bang about, 14 billion years ago. But what was before that, the religious person will ask? Well, who made the Big Bang? And if you ask a smart cosmologist, they'll say, there is no before the Big Bang. The time starts at the Big Bang, and the notion that there was something before that is a meaningless scientific question. So again, where does the universe come from? It has perhaps an answer that there may be multiverses, but we don't know it yet. How should we live? The religious answer, the way God wants you to. Again, this differs from religion to religion. If you're a Muslim, you go to Friday prayers, you wash your feet. You have the 5 pillars of Islam. But if you're a Catholic, you go to church, you eat fish on Friday, and you take wine and wafers. But again, there's no objective answer here. Scientific answer, there's no objective answer because there is no objective morality. And we can argue with that. I'm almost done here. We can argue about that later. I do not believe that any moral question is an objective question, that they all express a preference. Some of us have preferences in common, which is why there are certain moral strictures that are in common amongst many different people. But for questions, for example, like abortion, is it moral or not? Or being gay, is it moral or not? Different people will give you different answers, and you cannot resolve that question empirically. It's a matter of opinion. And in the end, I will claim that all morality comes down to preference. So how should we live has no objective answer. We just make certain societal conventions and agreements about we want our society to be harmonious. This is the way it should be if we're all going to live together peacefully. But here science can help. For example, if we want a better income distribution, or we want more people to have food, we want fewer people to be sick, then if that's your preference, and that should be your preference, but some people don't prefer that, they could care less, like Republicans, then it's true. If you specify your goals, science can help you attain them. But science cannot tell you how to live, okay? And religious people always say, see, you can't tell me how to live. And I'll say, yeah, but religion can't tell you how to live either. Because if you go across the next continent, you're going to get a different answer. Why is there evil in this world? This is the hard question for most religions. If God is good, if God is kindly and benevolent, why is the world so screwed up? Why do little babies die of leukemia and cancer? Why do we have tsunamis and monsoons that kill people that are completely innocent? How does that comport with the notion of a loving God? It doesn't, and this is the hard question for religious people, and they have answers which, as you most, are very silly answers by and large. One of them is that God gave us free will, and that's a great gift from above. And because we have free will, I have a whole lecture on why we don't, but if you believe that we have free will, then some people are going to do bad things just because God gave us the ability to choose to do right or wrong. And that the gift of free will is greater gift than the gift of having everything right. Now this runs into problems. For example, what does it mean when a child gets leukemia? What free will is being expressed there? The free will of cancer cells? And there's no answer. And why is there a tsunami or earthquakes? Why are millions of innocent people killed by natural accidents every year? Is there free will for tectonic plates or for the movement of the ocean? No, it doesn't make any sense. So, on this ground alone, many people have become atheists because there is no good answer to this question. But science has an answer. Evil is just a name given to humans because we're evolved in different ways. We're evolved to be both selfish and altruistic. We're evolved to be selfish to maximize our reproductive output. Sometimes that means that we will do things that will injure other people, okay? But sometimes we will do things to help other people. This is the inevitable byproduct of our evolutionary past. Why is there tsunamis and cancers? Well, this is the inevitable byproduct of the laws of physics because there are mutations that are the inevitable byproducts of cell replication, and some of those mutations cause cancer. And we have a world which is made of shifting plates, and when they shift the wrong way, you get an earthquake or a tsunami. And that's the answer. So to call that evil presupposes that there's a divine origin for these things. What we should say is, why are there things that people don't like very much? And science can answer that question. And I mean, this may not satisfy you, but it's the best that we're going to get to, if you keep an open mind. Why is there so much suffering in this world? Religious answer, we don't know. It's God's mysterious plan. God wants us to suffer. Mother Teresa, who worked here in Calcutta, thought that it was good to suffer. One of her cancer patients, and she didn't cure anybody, she pulled people off the streets of Calcutta and watched them die and hoped that they would convert to Christianity before they died. And one of her dying patients asked, Mother, I'm in pain. Why am I suffering so much? And Mother Teresa said, it's just Jesus kissing you. And the patient said, well, could you please stop asking him to kiss me? I mean, the reason we have pain is scientific. Pain is an evolved phenomenon to tell us that something is wrong with our bodies. When you put your finger in a flame, you pull it out because, well, you pull it out before you actually feel pain, because your nerves detect it before your consciousness does. But pain is an evolved phenomenon, and our pain neurons are there to tell us when we have something wrong with us that needs to be attended to. If you look down and your foot is stinging, it could be that there's a scorpion there, right? The only signal of that is pain. It's an adaptive phenomenon. You kick that thing off of you, okay? So we understand why there's physical pain. Emotional pain we're not so sure about, but it may be a way of dealing with suffering. As you may have to go through a period of grieving in order to become sanguine, normal human being again. Okay, so at least we have a scientific answer to this question. Why do we die? Good question for a theologian. I mean, why does God even put us on earth? Why doesn't he just transport us to heaven immediately? Or if he knows who's going to be good or bad, send us down there instead of up there. Why not cut out the middleman? The answer is, well, we're given a chance because of free will to be either good or bad on this planet. It's the same thing in Hinduism, I think, which presupposes, I believe, that you have a free will about how you live your life. If you live it the right way, you come back as a Brahmin. If you live it the wrong way, you come back as a rat. Why do we die? So we can attain the next level of our lives. I mean, that's Hinduism. In Christianity, it's because it's a way of God testing our ability to exercise our free will on the planet before we're then sent for eternity to either heaven or hell. The scientific answer is because our telomeres get shorter and protoplasm wears out. And there's also an antagonistic pleiotropy theory. Those genes that make us reproduce really fast when we're young, but have the unfortunate byproduct of making us fall apart when we're older, when it's too late to reproduce anyway, are those genes that get fixed in populations. And you can do tests with fruit flies to show that indeed, that if you select for young, vigorous fruit flies, they get old faster and die faster. So we have a scientific answer to this question of why do we die? How do we find, and this is the last question, how do we find release from suffering and sadness? And of course, you know the religious answer is always the same answer. Believe and worship God. Well, which God do you worship? Pascal's wager. You better pick the right one or you're in trouble. There's a secular answer, which I will offer here, which is various other ways of finding a release from suffering and sadness. This is how I do it, except for the Prozac part. And you know, it seems fatuous, but that's a good answer. I think it's a better answer than that one. Okay, so finally, the conclusions of this talk are, first of all, that the answers to the big questions are basically religious answers. They all presuppose that there is a divine being. If that being does not exist, and we have no evidence that one does, then you needn't consider these as existential questions. Religious answers diverge amongst religions. So therefore, they're not really answers, because there's no way of deciding which answer is the right one. You may find a religion which is more congenial to you personally, but that's not necessarily the same answer that your neighbor or somebody in another country will find. Religious answers are not testable. Therefore, they're not credible. If you cannot test something to see if it's correct or not, then it's not credible. Insofar as religious answers involve morality or similar subjective matters, secular humanism, which we can talk about later, gives us much better answers. All objective answers to the big questions involve empirical checking or testing. that is science vaguely construed. What I'm saying is that any question that involves an objective answer about the universe has to, per force, involve science. And finally, and we have to learn to live with this, and many people can't, some scientific questions and most existential questions cannot be answered with any degree of confidence, which means that as humans, we have to live a large portion of our lives in doubt. I think it's better, as Richard Feynman said, to live not knowing the answer to something than to live having answers that are likely to be false. So thank you very much.
So we do have time to take a few questions. Yeah?
Is our microphone so? Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So I have a couple of points to raise. One is...
Is that a questions or points? Because we want questions on lectures. So.
Sorry?
Do you have a question?
Yes. Well,
okay.
No. I mean, I would like to make statements about what you said, and you can respond to it if you wish to.
Okay. Just remember that other people have questions
sure.
too, so they have to be short.
Okay, you don't seem to be very welcoming of...
no, I'm welcoming. I'm just realizing that people that usually say this...
No, so my first objection to what you said, let me phrase it that way, is that your characterization of science was very one-sided and empiricist, and it does leave out the role of conceptualization and theory, which most scientists would view as something that's very essential for one's idea of science. Okay, well, it's not just a bag of facts. And in fact, in the second part of your talk, when you talked about what would be a scientific position, you did sort of implicitly acknowledge that there's more to science than a bag of facts and empiricism, but that's not what you said about what science was at the beginning of your talk. So that's one issue I have in terms of what you said.
Well, can I take them one at a time? Because I'm going to forget. I'm getting old. So first of all, I thought I did make it clear that conceptualization was part of science. In other words, hypothesis testing involves conceptualization of a hypothesis from the very beginning. So the second part of your question, I'm not sure exactly what you said, so maybe you could give them, just give them the microphone back, just so I can answer, because I want to answer your full question. So.
Right. No, but I think the point is when you do include the notion of theory building and conceptualization, it does raise a lot of questions about science itself as a methodology for finding the truth, which then you would have to address. So that's the reason I'm pointing that out. The second thing is not all religions are so God-centric as you made it out to be.
Sorry,
not all religions
yes.
are God-centric the way you characterize them. I think a lot of them are more sophisticated in sort of various ways that I don't have, but certainly because the single point criticism of religion came out to be that they all invoke the idea of God, and that statement is not correct.
Yeah, okay.
So,
yeah, okay.
And the third point is, I think when you look at the role of science vis-a-vis
Let me answer that second part because I forget your third. First of all, not all science has to have conceptual and hypothesis testing. Some of it is inductive, like Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. So you can, and when a plumber fixes your sink, it's conceptual in the fact that he says, well, the water could be coming from here and coming from there. So I think it's fairly clear that science is conceptual. And answer your second point, and I'll have to stop with there. I recognize fully that not all religions are God-centric. I don't think the Jains have a God. Many Buddhists don't have a God. There are people that are spiritual that don't have a God. The kind of religion I was talking about is the kind of religion that the vast majority of people on this planet hold. Now you can say it's unsophisticated, but you saw the figures of what Americans believe there. 84% of them believe that there is a God who actually takes an interest in you. So pointing out that there are some religions which do not hold in a divine being is not a criticism of what I said, because I was addressing those religions that explicitly make factual statements about the nature of the universe. Insofar as they don't, if you want to be a Jain or a Quaker or a Buddhist, well, even Buddhists believe in reincarnation. I mean, the Dalai Lama believes in karma and reincarnation, and those are, I mean, those aren't sophisticated theories. Those are empirical tests of the proposition. But yes, I recognize that some religions are not really religious in the sense of being accepting a deity. Yeah, and the other question?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes.
Your last slide mentioned that was that something religion is not testable. But
Sorry?
Religion is not testable. You mentioned
Religion
was
is
Not testable. Yes, okay.
But in Hinduism, I mean, I won't consider Hinduism as a religion, but in one of the sects, I mean, in one of our systems like yoga, we have four types of proofs, like proofs provided by the scriptures, proofs provided by any great person, your self-proofing, and your proof provided by your peers. So there is a whole system of challenging what is there in the scriptures and the way to prove it wrong also through your own experiences. So I mean, in a way, it can be testable. So that's a comment.
I'm not sure there was a question in there.
And it's just a comment. So what
Yeah,
are
I
your
know.
so what are your views on this? I mean,
Sorry?
so what would you like to?
Well, could you?
Please tell me if I'm paraphrasing you correctly.
Yeah.
He's saying that in some schools of thought within the Hindu tradition, there are fairly elaborate, layered ways of how you know things, starting from something that is known because it is described in ancient writings, it is explained to you by a teacher, you figure it out for yourself by essentially empirical testing, and so on. And so he's saying that perhaps in that sense there are certain aspects of religion that perhaps of some religions which could be open to empirical testing.
Well, yeah, I said that many claims of religion are empirically testable. One of them is that prayer works. Okay, so you can test that, and it doesn't work. There are claims that the Earth is 10,000 years old. That's an empirical claim. It was tested, and it was proven wrong. There are some claims that are harder to test, that Jesus Christ existed as a Son of God. Well, we don't have any record of Jesus Christ except in the Bible itself, and we don't want to believe just what's present in one book, so there's no way of checking it. Insofar as any religion would use the empirical toolkit, you can't just say, I believe this because my guru told me this, and I know that it's true, because I'll say, well, I don't believe that. You prove to me that it's true. Give me one example of a truth that comes from Hinduism that is an empirical truth. I'm asking you.
Well, what type of truth are you expecting? I mean,
Sorry?
I don't know. What type of truth are you
He's
expecting?
already defined what sense he's using truth in the beginning.
Something that exists in the universe and can be agreed upon by many people who are rational.
Yeah. For example, in ways of living. I mean, for example, if you sleep at night in a good time and wake up early, it really increases your performance. So that's a thing in Ayurveda.
That's not particularly unique to Hinduism.
What did he say?
If you sleep at a proper time, it'll be good for your health.
That's not a claim of Hinduism.
In Hinduism, we don't claim anything. So these are guidelines. You might want to follow it. And sorry for using the word Hinduism. I mean, it's a very subjected word coined by some English people. I don't know.
Yeah, but you told me that there are some branches of Hinduism in which there are ways of finding truth that are not.
So I was asking you, what type of truth are you expecting when you say?
I define it, as Amitabh said, as what is factually true about the universe, which can become knowledge if every rational person can agree on that. Okay. So, are you going to tell me that Ganesha had an elephant head? Is that going to be one of the?
No. I am not presupposing facts. I mean, I am also in the search of knowing things. I do not take things for granted, or I do not have any preconceived beliefs.
So you're actually being very empirical.
Yeah.
Right.
I'll let you answer the ones that I can't handle. Sorry.
Question? Yes.
of conviction.
Yeah, okay. It's a good start. I do believe everything I said, yes.
Some of my recent work, in a very limited way, tends to agree with you. So I am happy about that. But I have one question to ask you. What, as you have shown in your survey of the United States, the large majority of the people believe in a God.
85% at least.
That is not only true with your country, but it's also true with my country.
Correct. We're about equally religious. Yes.
My country is today governing a party which believes in Hindutva.
Mm-hmm.
So they want to, they are essentially polarizing the country. Now, what gives you the conviction that you can change all these people who are highly religious to your philosophy that you are advocating of science?
That's your what?
He's saying what gives you the
Courage,
conviction
yes.
that you can actually change the way of thinking of all these religious people to a more scientific way of
Yeah.
Oh, I can't. Oh,
But the majority of the people, both in your country and my country, are believers in God.
and that's a good question, and I'll answer it in several ways. First of all, I do not believe in any sense that I can convince the majority of religious people that to give up their religion, much less accept science or evolution. Because religion is an intensely personal thing. It is indoctrinated into children at a young enough age where they'll never give it up. So the courage of my conviction comes from two things. First of all, we know that it works in some cases. So when Richard Dawkins, for example, wrote The God Delusion, a book you may be familiar with, thousands of people wrote to him and said, thank you, thank you, thank you. You convinced me that there is no God. So at least it works sometimes, okay? And insofar as it works sometimes, that's all I require. In fact, I think if I converted one person in my life, I would regard that as having been successful. But I do not pretend to be able to make religion. I mean, that's why scientists are religious, because they're indoctrinated and brainwashed into religion when they're young. And by the time they get to be head of the National Institutes of Health, they can't give it up because it's too comforting to them. So yeah, the answer is, I don't think, and my second point is, and I didn't have time to talk about this, is that I don't think the world is going to give up religion because of people like me saying that there is no evidence for God. What's going to make the world become less religious, and what sociologists have told us makes it going to be less religious, is that as people rise in their socioeconomic well-being, they have no more need for a God. So for example, if I drew, I don't know if there's chalk here. No, there isn't. Is there any chalk around there? Okay, well, never mind. If you look at the least religious countries in the world, in which they're like 80 to 90% atheists, there are countries like Sweden, Finland, Norway, Iceland, Switzerland, France. If you look at the countries that are the most religious, the poorest countries in the world, there's a definite correlation between how good a country is and how religious it is. So the real way, and this is what Karl Marx realized, I'm not a Marxist, but when he said that religion is the opium of the people, he realized that religion is what people turn to when they have a hopeless condition, when their socioeconomic status is poor, when their government is corrupt, when there's pollution, when child mortality is high, when medical care is low, when there's a lot of homicide. These are conditions that obtain in India. They're conditions that obtain in the United States, which explains why they're religious. So, I mean, the best way that I could convince the world to give up religion was simply to work to make this world a more caring place, to make the world more like Norway or Denmark, where everybody is taken care of by their government. There's no poor people, old people get taken care of. There's free medical care, there's good medical care, there's no corruption. Child mortality is low. That's the real way to do it. But I can't change the world like that by standing on a stage here. All I can do is hope to reach a few of you to think about maybe there's not really much evidence behind what I believe. So that would be my answer. So.
Excuse me, I have here.
Is there a microphone for this gentleman?
I just wanted to ask you the inversion of, in a sense, what you said. So you talk about how literary perceptions in literature can't lead to empirical truths in a way. But what about the role of art and artistic experience in scientific practice? And what I mean to say is particularly, as far as my limited knowledge goes, in theoretical physics, some of the advances have been through an implicit perception of beauty and symmetry in a certain structure that guides you to forge ahead to discovering newer truths. So I would see it as an inversion. There is the artistic impulse in place which is guiding scientific practice. To follow what you would recommend as would be very dull scientific practice, I would dare say, where you form things purely based on empiricism. I think this is an after narrative that you are making of the practice of science, because scientists themselves don't work this way.
Well, you claim that, but if you look at the life of Charles Darwin, Charles Darwin admitted that he was tone deaf in terms of art. He had no taste for music, he had no taste for literature, he didn't like to look at art. The way the theory of evolution came about was a very different way from physics came about. It did not come by assuming that the world was beautiful and simple. It came by observing all these strange facts about the world and realizing that there was only one theory that could explain them. And it wasn't necessarily a beautiful theory, because natural selection is not a beautiful theory. It involves tremendous wastage, tremendous suffering, tremendous extinction of millions of species that have not left descendants. So I don't know if you're familiar with how evolution came about, but that's the way most biology comes about, not through assuming that things are simple. That's pretty much unique to physics, and I have to say that I addressed your question when I said at the end of my part on literature, when I said, can literature or art inspire science? And I said, yes, it can, in that it could suggest hypotheses that could then be tested. So insofar as physics has progressed because great physicists have thought that the way forward is to assume beauty and simplicity in our theories, then yes, that's a sort of artistic impulse. It's not art in the way that literature is, but it's a feeling about the world which has given rise to truth. But remember, every beautiful theory has to be tested empirically. And there are lots of beautiful theories in physics, like string theory, that may be wrong. There are also, as far as my friend Sean Carroll tells me, lots of ugly theories in physics that happen to be true. So beauty, while it may have been a guide to physical progress, is not, it's a way to help us forward, but whatever hypothesis you make on the assumption that things are beautiful has to be empirically tested in the end. And I thought that I had sort of said that during my talk, but maybe I didn't get it across good enough. But biology doesn't go the same way. Biologists don't start and say, well, the world has to be pretty simple. We don't work that way. And if that makes us dull fellows, well, then I'll have to confess that I'm a pretty dull fellow. So.
Yeah, at the back.
Sir, so whenever somebody compares science and religion, I personally had a feeling that they compare one's height with another's weight. So it's like, it sounded like what? Just because there are two numbers, you can find the ratio? It sounded very absurd to me. And thing is, you tried to define science. That was well and good, fine. Did you try to define religion?
If I might paraphrase the question and tell me if I'm getting this right. So he's saying that when you compare science and religion, it's a little bit like comparing two different things, like a height and a weight. Just because you can express both in numbers, it doesn't mean they're really comparable.
That was just my comment. I mean, I just found it.
Yeah.
That was just my comment.
Okay.
My question is, you tried to define science. Did you try to define religion?
Sorry. You try to define religion because you defined what you meant by science, broadly construed.
Yes.
Would you try to define what you mean by religion in the context of comparing the two?
Yeah, I should have done that. I used Dan Dennett's definition of religion, which is the belief in a supernatural being that in general cares about individuals on the earth, and not all religions follow this, and B, confers a moral code upon us. So it's the worship and propitiation of a supernatural being that is above us all. And along with that go two caveats, that this being usually has a moral code that goes along with his existence. And second of all, that this being has a personal interest in our individual welfare. That's Dan Dennis' definition of religion. By and large, it holds for most religions in the world, but not all of them. But those were the kinds of religions that I was talking about, because those are the religions that make empirical claims about the universe. And it's a good, yeah, I forgot to define it, so.
I understand that you're talking about false beliefs, probably. Probably religion is not the right word, maybe.
Sorry?
What do you mean by false belief?
Whatever he just mentioned, that believing in a supernatural, whatever he just talked about, supernatural being and...
Okay, so if that by definition is false belief, then what is your definition of religion?
This, I don't know, this is what I think is false belief, and
Yeah.
I do not have a definition for religion. I'm not talking about it.
Okay, but you are asking about it, that's fine.
Yeah,
There's
because-
a question here. Yeah.
So my stand is, I think, perhaps somewhat more of a morbid stand, in that what I would like to claim is it not possible that perhaps science is wrong and we may never know? Like, for example, in the case of Newtonian mechanics,
Yes.
when it first came about, people thought that explained everything. It was only after 200, 300 years that people realized it's wrong. So
It's not wrong, it's a special case of quantum mechanics.
Right.
And it works very well.
Could not be the case even with something like, say, string theory or something, that you might do something is right at a particular point of time, you may believe it to be true and correct,
Yeah.
we may not be right. And
Yeah.
what's worse is we may never know that we may not be right. So wouldn't
Yeah,
that
but,
be
yeah, but why are you saying this?
no, I mean, wouldn't that be something that is like a sort of shortcoming of science, in that it might
It might be
us believe
wrong.
something that's not
Well,
true, but
what I'm going to have to hold my temper, because I think I said that in my talk. I said science is provisional, and it can be wrong, and it has been wrong. But nevertheless, it is the best way we know to make progress in understanding the universe. If we want to know what causes Black Plague, we have a scientific investigation tells us that it's a certain bacillus. If we want to know what causes earthquakes, tectonic plates. So yeah, science can be wrong, and it has been wrong, and we regard all knowledge as provisional. But nevertheless, it has been immensely helpful in the progress of humanity. How many of you people would be dead if there wasn't antibiotics, for example? Raise your hand if you're going to, okay.
Can
Well,
I
that's
just add
Yeah.
something to that? See, while it is true that many things asserted by science can be wrong, among the major systems that claim to we might be wrong, we might be wrong, we might be wrong, in science that we are doing it all the time.
What the young man said, which is that science can be wrong. That's an example of a subtle way, I don't know if you're religious or not, but it's a subtle way of denigrating science by saying it can be wrong. Amitabh is right, it can be wrong, but we have ways of knowing that it's wrong. Whereas if you ask a Christian, how do you know, what would convince you that Jesus wasn't the Son of God? They would say, there's nothing that can convince me of that. I know it's true. Even if there was a camera, and people have said this, in Jesus' tomb that showed that he rotted, I would still believe that he was resurrected. Now, that's a profoundly anti-realistic attitude. Now, I just asked people to raise their hand if they would have died without antibiotics, which is the product of science, and about a third or a quarter of you people did. So I would ask you, if you had an infection, would you go to your priest or would you go to a doctor? Okay, you go to the doctor, right? And why would you go to the doctor? Because the doctor has used science in his background to test.
My point was not that I mean, I was not trying to be, I'm not religious. The point I was trying to make is we need something much better than science. I'm not saying that we need...
Much better than science?
What I'm trying to say is we need something far superior than science. Science cannot...
No, slow down, slow down. Slow down. We need something superior to science? Do you have any suggestion about...
Well, let me butt in again.
Okay.
So I think science is getting better over time, from its origins in the early days of civilization till now. So perhaps science 100 years down the line will be able to do more and explain more than it is right now, and in that sense it will be something better than the present day science.
Well, let me make a comment on that, because We will know more, and we will have improved a lot of humanity, but I'm willing to bet that the methods that we use 100 years from now are going to be exactly the same.
Right.
So the method of science is not going to change. It's been honed since the 16th century. And if you have a suggestion for ways better than science, then you should write an article about it. But I can tell you that it's not going to involve religion. Because religion is not going to help us cure diseases, it's not going to help us cure epilepsy, it's not going to help us grow better crops. It will hardly do anything for humanity except divide us into factions that... Vidya?
Okay. After, there's one person asking after that.
Yeah.
So if you had found that piece of chalk and you had made that graph of the relationship between religiosity and socioeconomic condition of a society, you would have presumably found that the United States was an outlier.
No, it actually isn't, because if you do and I have this graph not on me, if you do a socioeconomic analysis of America using the so-called 20 socioeconomic factors, we're not an outlier. We're not very well off, and the reason why is because, first of all, we have high levels of child mortality, we don't have free health care, we don't take care of old people very well. We have a certain amount of corruption in our government. We have huge levels of income inequality. So in fact, if you plot the socioeconomic status of the United States compared to other sort of first world countries, we're amongst the lowest. And if you do the correlation of religiosity versus socioeconomic welfare, and it looks like that, the US is down here. And that was determined independently of its religiosity. And so this is a sociological phenomenon which I realized existed long before I came along, that the way that religion tends to disappear in terms of if a country gets better and better and better in taking care of its people. Why is that? Because people, they believe in God more when they need help and they have nobody to turn to, and so they pray to a God. We can see this in the United States because we have fluctuations in income inequality over years, the Gini index. Some years it's more equal than others. And then if you look at religiosity, income inequality goes up, religiosity goes up a year later. Income inequality goes down, religiosity, and so it goes like this. And that shows that the income inequality is causal of religiosity, which is what Karl Marx said, Religion is the heart of a heartless earth. It's the opium of the people. Marx wanted to, I don't believe in Marx, I don't believe in communism, but he realized that as long as you adhere to religion, you lose your motivation for changing society because you think, well, we're going to have a better life up there, we can suffer down here, but things will be better in the long run. And then, that way you lose all your motivation to improve humanity, or at least a lot of it. And I have a question.
That it's as old as humanity. There has been a lot of empirical trial and error in trying to show that something works. I would almost think that primates using tools would be science.
What you're calling science is rationality. Yeah. And I agree with you that we've had that but remember what happened before in a pre-scientific way. So for example, when people had epilepsy, 300, 400 years ago, it was the wrath of God. When we had bubonic plague, it was the fault of the Jews. When we had lightning, it was God's wrath. These were supposedly rational people, but they didn't have any way to investigate their explanations. So, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but yes, you're right. It's the rational way to try to answer questions. But if you don't have a way to answer those questions, then you tend to make up answers that don't work, and that causes problems for society. Now, science, the word science wasn't invented until the 16th century or so. So why I call it science broadly construed is because that's when science formally began.
So would it be fair to say that science broadly construed began in many other parts of the world long before it did in Europe?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's a whole tradition of Hindu science, Persian science, Greek science, although Greek is considered the West, Egyptian science, and then for a long time, science it disappeared, and then science as a profession, as professional science started. That's largely a Western concern, but it's by no means true that that this way of investigating the world comes from the West. So.
Okay, we'll make this the last question. There is tea after that, and so you can continue to discuss things with Professor Coyne over tea as well. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a small point in your conclusion slide saying that for morality we can look for secular humanism instead of religion.
Yes.
And I think despite all its drawbacks and all that's caused, one thing is we cannot deny that religion has helped bring in a moral code of conduct for us. And religion did bring in morality in people when it was needed. So could you please explain what secular humanism is and how it's superior to religious morality?
Morality does not come from religion. Religion props up morality. And this was realized by Plato thousands of years ago in the Euthyphro dialogues, where he says, is something good because God says it, or is God say it because it's good? And the answer is, if God told you to go and kill your mother, would you do it because God said so? And you would say no. And I would say, why not? And you'd say, because it's wrong. And when you answer that way, you realize, as Plato did, that our conception of God as good comes from a pre-biblical conception of what is good and bad. And we simply impute a secular morality to religion. So what religion is good for is for propping up morality. But it's not good for originating morality, because look at the kind of morality that comes from religion as opposed to secular humanism. I mean, it's horrible. We have Shias and Sunnis killing each other. I mean, is that when we have ISIS throwing gay people off of churches? In the United States, we have, you know, Christians opposing abortion or equal rights for people. And religion has been behind all that. It supported slavery, you know, and secular humanism, I think, you know, where you actually worry about the welfare of your fellow human beings and what's best for society, instead of worrying about what some guy says. I mean, religious morality says stuff like, don't use contraception. Okay, is that good? Are we supposed to, I mean, that's what Catholics tell us. Are we supposed to not use condoms because we think God told us that? No, and if you think about it hard, and Plato realized this a long time ago, we say God is good because we have a notion of what is good, and then we simply impute those qualities to God. We don't derive our notion of good and bad from what God said, because what God says in the Quran or in the Bible is really horrible. God says in the Old Testament, for example, that you should kill any child who curses his parents. If somebody picks up sticks on the Sabbath, they should be killed. If somebody commits adultery, they should be stoned. Okay, that's Bible, that's God religious morality. And you can get the same thing from Islam, you can get the same thing from Judaism. So I don't, you know, religion is not a source of morality at all. It's simply the codification of what we humans both evolved and realized civilly and secularly is the right way to behave in order to form a society that's harmonious.
Okay, with that, I think we'll close the former session. Let's thank Professor Coyne once again.
Thank you.
And on behalf of the Academy, a small token of our appreciation.
Oh, should I open it?
If you like.
Okay. I like presents. And my birthday's 2 days from now, so.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah. Ah, lovely. C.V. Raman.
Pictorial memoir of C.V. Raman, the founder of the Academy.
This is wonderful.
And it has quite a lot of historical letters and other things. And this is a
That's great.
recently updated biographical memoir.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. So.
Please join us for tea across.
Sorry? Oh, I think. Thank you. Thank you. That's great.